Chapter 35 The Spiritual Harvest. Swami Abhedananda's preaching in America was no ordinary work. It was, in fact, the scattering of the spiritual harvest of Sri Ramakrishna, which was initially garnered by Vivekananda. We have seen how the ice ball put in motion in 1893 grew to be larger as it rolled on till the end of the first decade of the 20th century. It required the constructive genius of Abhedananda to translate the ideas and aspirations of his predecessor into an actual fact. We have seen how the mastermind of the Hindu preachers succeeded in giving shape and form to the dreams of Vivekananda in creating a serene spiritual climate in America. As a matter of fact, Abhedananda did not spare himself in discharging the sacred responsibility that was entrusted to him by Vivekananda. History will one day record that the entire story of the Vedanta movement in the West is the beautiful and inspiring saga of the lives of two self-sacrificing sannyasins. One played the role of a conqueror, while the other played the role of discoverer. For if Swami Abhedananda did anything, he discovered the soul of the people of America, and thereafter he saturated it with the highest ideals of the universal truth. As one surveys the history of his work, one finds Abhedananda, like Vivekananda, moving through the West as some mighty, glorious, and effulgent light. If Vivekananda was looked upon by the people of the West as the lordly monk, it is no less true to say that his successor, Abhedananda, was similarly hailed as the loving monk, as the American papers used to speak of him. What really, therefore, accounted for the remarkable success of his mission was his attitude, which was always assertive, but never aggressive or antagonizing. During the latter part of his work in America, covering the period from 1911 to 1921, Abhedananda was a mature man, and as one follows carefully all his lectures and discourses at this time, one is sure to find in them a good deal of mature thinking. This qualitative change is discernible in some of the lectures that he was invited to deliver at various places. One also notices that since his Brooklyn lectures, Abhedananda preferred more to make the glory of the ancient Indian culture and civilization as the central theme of his propagation more than anything else. India was then passing through a momentous period of national resurgence, and it was therefore quite appropriate on the part of the Hindu preacher to give expression of it before the people of America. India's religious supremacy was no longer debated. It was then accepted fact. So Abhedananda devoted his time and talent to focus Indian culture in its proper perspective, wherever he found opportunity to do so. This was, in fact, his special contribution during this period, and unless one takes into account the significance of it, one cannot correctly follow the trends of his preaching during the period we are now speaking of. And viewed historically, this was almost inevitable in bringing the entire Vedanta movement there to its logical conclusion. For instance, when in the middle of 1911, Abhedananda received an invitation from the president of the Brooklyn Ethical Association, a distinguished religious cultural body, to deliver a lecture on India's gift to the world, he readily accepted it. 15 years ago, it was the privilege of Swami Vivekananda to appear before this body, and he also then spoke on the same subject. And judging from the records, one should say that it was Vivekananda's most memorable lecture in America. History sometimes repeats itself, but it seldom repeats it with such remarkable coincidence as we find in the lives of Vivekananda and Abhedananda, as they both delivered lectures on an identical subject and before the same body as an interval of 15 years. A votary and also a defender of Indian culture as Swami Abhedananda was, he delivered on this occasion one of his finest lectures, which covered not only religion and philosophy, but also science, literature, and art, as they flourished in ancient India. It was not a religious preacher that spoke on that occasion. It was a historian that stood before the distinguished and selected audience who were impressed with the speaker's integral vision in history. Unless one views, said Abhedananda in this lecture, the early history of India, most of which are shrouded in obscurity, in its proper perspective, one cannot be said to have known India correctly. If she is great in philosophy, she was nevertheless great on other spheres such as mathematics, astronomy, music, and art and literature. Even in the opinion of some eminent Indologists in literature, our epics and poems and dramas rank as high as those of any language. They have a kind of perfection, a perfection that one with sustained and complete seriousness for which they are unique, and which we miss in Homer or Virgil. It requires special attitude and aptitude to fully comprehend the distinctive creative genius of ancient India in all spheres: religion, philosophy, art, literature, and science. The richness of Indian art and music is seldom understood in the West. Her greatness stands on her great traditions, which are inherently profound. Time was when India not only achieved great things, nay, the greatest, both in the inner and outer fields of her activity, but the exalting sublimities of her culture and thought have been for ages the perennial source of inspiration to many a people for all their strivings after a high degree of refined existence. The West must acknowledge her debt to India, which is the motherland of all races. Did not an eminent American thinker say that Mother India is in many ways the mother of us all? At the close of the lecture, Swami Abhedananda answered a number of questions in regard to the ancient heritage of India. He also answered several questions in regard to the social customs of India, about which there were still some wrong notions prevalent among a section of people in America. According to the reports appearing in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, this particular lecture of Abhedananda was enthusiastically received by the audience and warmly appreciated. It said, "He was frequently and heartily applauded. With him on the platform sat the president of the association." From a close study of this lecture, one can find some coincidence with the views of Vivekananda, expressed more than 15 years earlier. Evidently, the minds of those two great preachers were attuned to the same scale. They were so much alike in their content and expression that sometimes it becomes somewhat difficult on the part of an observer to distinguish between their respective utterances in support of Indian culture and civilization. Here, both of them stand on the same plane and speak almost in the same vein, for both of them appear to us to be the same cast of mind when they appeared in this particular role. Professor Binoy Kumar Sakar, who was then in America and who sometimes met Swami Abhedananda, has rightly observed, if Vivekananda placed India on the spiritual map of the world, Abhedananda did no less in putting her on the cultural map of the world. It was he who finally established the cultural supremacy of India during his prolonged stay in America, and this might very well be regarded as the final upshot of the whole Vedanta movement there. His signal contribution in this regard has never been fully assessed or understood. He was India's first cultural ambassador to America. Here it should be mentioned that it was about this time that Swami Abhedananda took an initiative in the welfare of the Indian students coming to America for higher study, which eventually took shape in the Indo-American Club, which was founded under the auspices of the New York Vedanta Society. Besides promoting the Indo-American cordiality, the main object of the club was to look after the Indian students in the state and to help them in all possible ways. Dr. Bhupendra Nath Dutt, the younger brother of Swami Vivekananda, who was advised by Sister Nivedita to go to America, has left a record from which we gather that Swami Abhedananda put his heart and soul for the welfare of the Indian students in America, most of whom had participated in the national movement and also suffered hardships. It is not perhaps known to many in India that it was more or less due to the initiative of Swami Abhedananda that there came into being in New York a residence for the Indian students known as the India House. When Swami Abhedananda met in London Pandit Shyamyambi Krishnavarma, he was very much impressed with the India House that was founded by him in 1905. And since then, he was thinking of having a similar institution in New York for the benefit of the Indian students. When I met him at the headquarters of the Vedanta Society in New York, I was very much impressed with his keenness about the prospect of more and more Indian students coming to America for higher study. Why should they go to England and seek admission to Oxford or Cambridge when there are a good number of colleges and universities in America where students are provided with excellent facilities for education? I recall these words of Swami Abhedananda. Thus wrote Bhupendranath long after his return to India. Among other notable Indian students in America at that time was Dr. Taraknath Das, who also came into contact with Swami Abhedananda. Dr. Das also bears a similar testimony to Abhedananda's interest in the welfare of Indian students, and in an article which he wrote after the passing away of the Swami, he has recorded his impression of Swami Abhedananda, paying glowing tributes to his extra Vedantic activities in America during the second decade of the 20th century. There must have been some salient reason for it. The picture that India presented herself at the turn of the century was first realized by Swami Vivekananda, who had cherished to the inner recess of his mind a sort of regeneration for his country, but he was not spared by Providence to have this intention fulfilled. Abhedananda, who knew the mind of Vivekananda more than anybody else, had a similar placed a high faith on India's regeneration, which then depended to a large extent on the rising generation of young Indians, and this is why he particularly interested himself in the affairs of the Indian students, who then went to America for higher studies. It is on record how such students were helped by the recommendation of the Vedanta Society. In a number of cases, they were presumably recommended by Swami Abhedananda, which earned for them easy admission into some well-known colleges and universities. This is but another proof of his wide popularity in the academic circle of America. Now we will enter into one of the most crowded years in the life of Swami Abhedananda. During his long career as a preacher, he delivered some of the excellent lectures in 1913. His continuous work left no time for the rest, which he needed then most. So in the early month of 1913, he went on a sea voyage for rest and recreation to the port of Fernandina as the guest of his friend and pupil, Captain Hergon. He stayed there for a week, and we gather from the news record of February 28, 1913, that during the whole period of his stay there, Swamiji, who was well received and welcomed by the people of this port town, spoke to a large audience gathered in the Methodist Church, at the Grand Theater and the Library Hall, and at the school building. Everywhere the subject of his lecture was universal religion that comes within the teaching of all denominations. He was very convincing in his arguments. The paper also described him as a historian and as fluent and eloquent a speaker. From here he went to Jackson Villa, where he delivered several addresses in explanation of his system of universal religion. The year 1913 saw him scathing the spiritual harvest in abundance and in a number of cities. The intensity of his lectures delivered by Swami Abhedananda during this time differed from his earlier lectures, though the pattern remained much the same. Here we would like to give some examples to just convey an idea as to Abhedananda's depth of expression. A close study of these lectures would at once reveal that he describes not only Vedanta philosophy, but all the different religions of the world of which he was a great scholar, showing their common aims and their varied creeds. For instance, while lecturing in the Carnegie Library in Atlanta under the auspices of the Atlanta Psychological Society on March 3rd, Abhedananda summarized the aim of the Vedanta philosophy by saying that it sought to understand the one unchangeable reality, spirit, which exists everywhere and throughout all eternity, and of which our souls are merely one inseparable part. Our spirits are like the waves or eddies in the great endless ocean of ether. Essentially, a wave looks like something different from the ocean itself, but internally they are one and the same. So our soul, merely a manifestation of the all-powerful Spirit of God. In the headquarters of the New York Vedanta Society, there were various symbols of worship which had evoked considerable inquisitioners among the members of the society. On an occasion before a select gathering, Abhedananda said, explaining his symbols, "Let me first explain to you the significance of the altar which we call the Vedanta altar. It stands for the altar of the heart and is dedicated to the Supreme Spirit, which is the soul of our souls, called Atma, and where nature is absolute existence, intelligence, and bliss, known as Sat-Chit Ananda. It is dedicated to the self-effulgent light of the Sun of infinite wisdom, which dispels the darkness of ignorance in the human heart. It is not meant for any individual spirit, but for the infinite spirit, which is the source of all personal manifestations and divine incarnations. A worshipper of Christ should think of Christ upon the altar. A worshipper of Buddha or Krishna, Shiva, Jehovah, or Allah should think of his ideal as seated upon the symbolic altar of the heart. In every case, it should be remembered that the altar stands as the symbol of the heart of the worshipper. Names and forms are merely manifestations of the one nameless and formless infinite being to whom the Vedanta altar is dedicated. The light of the candle is the symbol of the light of the intellect. It is the light of the pure intellect that reveals the spirit seated upon the altar of the heart. Purified heart and intellect must be united before spiritual realization is attained. Flowers are symbolic of the good thoughts and pure feelings which should be offered to the Supreme Spirit. And when fruits are offered, they stand for the fruits of our works. In another lecture at Los Angeles, Abhedananda explained the divine motherhood, about which the Western people had no idea. We quote the following lines from the Los Angeles Tribune. Divine motherhood is the special gift of India's spiritual tradition. The worship of God as mother is unknown to the West, but the Hindus from prehistoric times have worshipped the eternal creative energy, which is eminent in nature as the divine mother of the universe. The more we comprehend God as immanent in nature, the more clearly we understand God as our mother as well as our father. In modern times, it was Sri Ramakrishna who revealed this truth to us. We knew that in England, both Professor Max Muller and Professor Paul Deussen were impressed with Abhedananda's knowledge of Sanskrit and philosophy. In America, too, he met many whose names stood at the forefront in the world of education, such as Professor Royce Landman and Professor William James of Harvard, and Professor Jackson, to name only a few of them. During this period, he was invited on several occasions to lecture before American universities, including Columbia, Harvard, and University of California at Berkeley. From the themes and the patterns of lecturing during this phase, it would appear that Abhedananda virtually played the role of a dignified teacher. Again, on numerous occasions while lecturing in various churches, Abhedananda often found bishops among his audience, including the well-known Bishop Potter of New York. On these occasions, his theme was the Hindu idea of Christ. Once he, by special request, lectured before 40 of the chief ministers of the various denominations in New York. He also expounded his doctrines before the Parliament of Religions held at New York and Boston. It will thus be seen that the life he led during the year 1913 and the years following it were of immense activity, which practically left him with no time for rest. Thus, a new spiritual climate was created by his untiring efforts, while Vedanta flourished with the freshness of a spring flower. The whole movement grew larger and larger, and the ripple created by Vivekananda now assumed the dimension of a tidal wave that eventually swept the American mind. In fact, it was in the Abhedananda era in the field of religious preaching in America, and what was true of America was equally true in the case of Europe. He crossed the Atlantic not less than 17 times during the whole period of his stay in America, and traveled throughout France and Belgium, Holland, Germany. He went to Australia, Italy, and Switzerland. Likewise, in America, he was constantly on the move, passing through the country from Alaska to Mexico, from Quebec to Vancouver. In the estimation of Professor Horschel Parker of Columbia University, one of the earliest admirers of the Swami, he worked like a giant for popularizing and preaching the gospel of universal religion, saying, "His mission as a preacher was purely educational and philosophical." Thus, it would be no exaggeration to say that in the elucidation and dissemination of Vedanta philosophy to the people of the West, Swami Abhedananda, of all the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, stands right with Vivekananda. The year 1913 saw Abhedananda delivering some important lectures at Atlanta, which he visited in March of that year, accompanied by Professor Herschel Parker, president of the New York Vedanta Society. The first lecture was delivered before a distinguished gathering at the meeting of the Ethical Association, and such eminent persons as Felix Adler and J.W. Lee were present as speakers. Swami Abhedananda was invited especially, and the subject matter of his lecture was the contribution of India's thought to social ethics, which, according to the reports of the newspaper The Constitution, was highly appreciated. Here in Atlanta, he also delivered a series of 7 lectures at the Unitarian Church every afternoon for a week under the auspices of the Atlanta Psychological Society. Reporting his arrival in the city, the Atlanta wrote, "Clad in scarlet robes and flaming turban, Swami Abhedananda, the recognized leader of Vedanta, arrived in the Piedmont Hotel last night on March the 5th, 1913. Abhedananda succeeds Vivekananda, the Great One, who was for many years the leading exponent of this Vedantic philosophy." Thus, it will be noted that most of the American papers always mention the two names together, Swami Vivekananda and Swami Abhedananda. And always these two figures loom large before the gaze of the American people. The other important lectures that he gave were at the Carnegie Library. Here, his first lecture was on Vedanta philosophy, and the other on the realization of the soul. Both the lectures were elaborately published in the Atlanta Journal. Speaking about the Vedanta philosophy, Abhedananda said, "Vedanta is at once the most ancient and the most modern of philosophies. Vedanta stands for no special creed, philosophy, or religion, but teaches the accumulated wisdom. It stresses the Delphic oracle of Socrates, 'Know thyself,' and that it teaches that all progress in the evolution of God involved in man, evolution presupposes involution. When one of the audience asked him, "What is your philosophy?" Abhedananda at once replied smilingly, "My philosophy is most striking in its scope, and the most salient point about it not only harmonizes all religions, but harmonizes religion with all the sciences." In fact, this was one of his often repeated epigrams. An interesting incident happened on his arrival at Atlanta, which should be mentioned. He was hailed as Prince Abhedananda, and in a class lecture here he is reported to have made this remark: "They call me a prince among men, though I have no princely kingdom, but a spiritual teacher is a prince among men." Another memorable incident in the life of the Hindu preacher happened when he visited down south in Los Angeles, California in April 1913. Here he gave a course of 8 lectures at the Unitarian Church. All his lectures were largely attended by interested and sincere seekers after spiritual truth. And here the Unitarian and Universalist ministers invited Abhedananda to fill their pulpits and to give sermons on Sunday morning. According to the reports published in the New Thought News, one sermon was so interesting that everyone heard it with eyes fixed on the person who stood on the pulpit. As the paper added, "This will go down in the lives of those who heard it as an hour of inspiration and upliftment." No other preacher belonging to the order of Ramakrishna during this period or before was ever invited to deliver a sermon from the pulpit, and this instance is but a testimony of Abhedananda's wide popularity in America as a preacher. But it was the ashrama, or the Vedantic school on the Berkshire Hills, that engaged most of Swami Abhedananda's time and attention since 1910. The full story of this second peace retreat in America has been told by one of his American disciples, Sister Shivani, in her book, Swami Abhedananda in America. And the inquisitive readers might well do to read the particular chapter, Ashrama Thresholds, which is the most absorbing portions of this highly interesting book. In his training of the disciples here, Abhedananda always brought home to them the assurance of the self in its supremacy. He had the peculiar way of penetrating into the hearts of his disciples, hauling them back into some semblance of common sense and sanity. He could easily redirect the reason of many a stubborn disciples and turn their follies toward wisdom. Such a beloved master, such a tender guru, one can hardly expect to come in contact with, Sister Shivani wrote. His very radiant smile could change many stern hearts and direct them to the sober path. The ashrama was the special gift of his talent. It was not exactly a replica of Shanti Ashrama or the peace retreat of Swami Turiyananda. It was a place of retreat where those who wished to renounce the world could find refuge under suitable conditions. On one occasion, stressing the importance of meditation, Abhedananda said to his disciples, "The followers of Vedanta who live up to their professed creed should spend half an hour every day in meditation, at least. Meditation is the most important and absolutely necessary step in spiritual progress." Among the disciples who lived in the ashrama, there were many who loved Abhedananda in the best way they knew. All were great souls to him, and he bestowed his care and loving kindness equally to all. They left their ways to follow where he led. Some had book learning, some knew the world. All brought their service and their love. None there were who did not bring him honor. In the testimony of some of his close disciples while spending his days at the ashrama, Swami Abhedananda walked the lovely way, saw no evil but only incompleteness. As a true acharya, he removed the shams, the blunders, and the inmates of the ashram, both men and women, reasserted their own restoration. This was the life in the Connecticut ashrama, which was a very beautiful acreage covering wooded hill and dale, an utterly ideal setting for a philosophical and religious retreat. There were several springs, and a flowing stream watered the rolling pastures. 2 large cottages, the Peace Cottage and the Lotus Cottage, and a few single cabins, ample barns and sheds. Here congregated resident workers, students, disciples, and visitors for longer or shorter periods of time, as befitted their release from town, job, or profession. Judging from all available records, we might say that the Vedanta Ashrama on Berkshire Hills was the crowning success of Swami Abhedananda. It was this ashrama which in course of time assumed the focal ground of spiritual harvest, and it was the historical fulfillment of the entire Vedanta movement. It was the dream of both Vivekananda and Abhedananda to establish a slice of Tapavan as it existed in ancient India, on the soils of America, where a synthesis was reached between spirituality and materialism, between the Vedantic doctrine and the doctrine of everyday life of modern man, and finally between science and religion, which is the need of the 20th century.